COP28 starts today, marking the annual United Nations Climate Summit. We're going to be talking about that in just a moment. Stanley Johnson is here. But first of all, I want to ask you about this tweet from our viewer, Edwin, who says the only way the Conservatives can save themselves is to make Nigel Farage the leader. He's right, isn't he?
Well, I said, I think, in this studio not so long ago, that actually the Conservatives ought to open their arms to Nigel Farage instead of taking a standoff attitude. Because I think we cannot afford to have a man of that talent not in our camp at the next election.
Fascinating.
Now, as for the leader question, that is above my pay grade. But I think we definitely need him as part of the troops.
Well, why wouldn't Rishi Sunak agree with you? I mean, he can't even bring himself to say his name in public. He says things like Nigel's lot, doesn't he?
Hey, listen, I don't want to use up my climate time talking about Nigel Farage.
Go on. We've not started on the jungle yet, but come on, we were interested to know what you think, Stanley.
I think we need him. I think we're going to have him, by the way.
Do you?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that he is going to help, as it were, save quite a lot of what we might call the red wall.
Will you have him before the next election?
I would hope so.
Really interesting. Well, Stanley, have you got inside intelligence, or is this just your view?
I've been watching him in the jungle, as you can imagine. I have quite an interest.
A vested interest, having been there yourself.
Tell us about COP28. Is it just an expensive talking shop, Stanley? You're a committed environmentalist.
Yeah, I am an admitted environmentalist. I've been doing this for quite a long time, since actually 1964, I think, when I did.
Even longer than the King?
Well, by the way, the King is opening the session, I think it's tomorrow, and that is very, very good news. By the way, your intro, it said future climate change. Well, it's not actually future climate change, it's present climate change. Is it a load of nonsense? No, it's absolutely not a load of nonsense. Go back to Glasgow. Glasgow came up with some good things. I'm talking about COP26 in Glasgow in December 2021. It came up with some good things because actually it managed to get the global net zero by 2050 adopted as a target. You know, targets are one thing, getting there is another. And that's what this COP is about, getting there. And I think there is a huge, huge way still to go. But there's some really promising signs. I think I might mention also here that I've spent quite a lot of time recently in China. And one of the extraordinary developments which we're going to see, I think, taken note of in COP is the progress of renewable energy around the world. In China, we are in the process of putting in, when I say we, I mean they, a huge, fleets and fleets of solar panels, being
But at the same time, they're opening more and more coal mines.
Well, let's be clear about this. China has a policy of producing energy from coal. That is where some of it energy comes from. Some of it comes from imports. Some of it now comes increasingly from wind power and solar power. But what you're going to find, I think, is even some of these coal plants which are being opened will actually be on standby. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
If you're running a system of renewables, you've got to have the standby. So China has said its emissions are going to peak. Officially, it said they're going to peak by 2030. In practice, it looks as though, and people are talking about that in Dubai now, they're going to peak earlier. This is going to make a huge difference to the general attitude. I think we're going to see also in COP a kind of a consensus of agreeing to triple renewable energy. And that, of course, is going to take the pressure off the oil and the gas and the others, because the more and more you get from your renewable energy sources, that has a price effect on coal and gas and so on.
It also has a price effect on our viewers and listeners, Stanley, because it's expensive.
Well,
people are struggling already.
I'm not sure if it's more expensive. I think what we're going to find is that renewable energy will undercut the cost of energy from traditional greenhouse gas producing sources, fossil fuel. And the other thing, of course, big challenge, and of course it's interesting that it's in Dubai, is will they deliver in Dubai the thing which they were nudging towards in Glasgow, which is calling for a phase out of fossil fuels. Now, what you got in Glasgow was a phase out on coal. What they're trying to get in Dubai is an agreement, a world agreement, to phase out in a timetable to be determined fossil fuels. It has to come. Whether it'll come in Dubai is another matter.
Are you Are you comfortable with it being held in Dubai? I mean, I remember being in Dubai on holiday, and it was 50 degrees outside, Stanley, and there was an indoor snow ski slope which was being generated clearly not by solar power. They have complete disregard, it seems, to how much power they use, they generate, they're building, they take swathes of land out of the ocean in terms of even just an environmental perspective, not necessarily climate change, but on their environmental record, they're diabolical.
Well, you've got two different aspects to cover here. First, you've got to have the UAE's own as a domestic environmental climate change policy. B, you've got to deal with how are they managing this exercise of being president of COP. I think it's going to work. The COP kind of rotates around the world. I think we've had like 40 COPs since it started. We've had already one in that region. They have realized that they are part of the problem, but they're also part of the solution. And bear in mind that they are in that blessed part of the world where the sun shines. And we are going to find, and I'm repeating myself here, that actually the renewable part of the even UAE energy production is going to increase more and more. I'm talking terawatts here.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what comes out of COP anyway. We're keeping a very cynical eye on it, aren't we?
We are here. We've got to ask you about Matt Hancock today, giving evidence of the COVID inquiry. It's very significant. He was part of the Quad, resigned from the cabinet for breaking his own lockdown rules. What should they be asking him today, Stanley?
Well, it's funny you should ask about Matt Hancock. I was one of the few people. Everything goes back to the jungle, doesn't it? I was one of the few people who actually said he did pretty well in the jungle.
Yeah.
I was in a pretty minority. I thought he was fantastic in the jungle. Now, on the COVID, I'm very, very struck by the way this inquiry. I don't mean to sort of throw, nasturtiums anywhere, but why isn't this inquiry actually concentrating on the main issue, which is were we or weren't we right?
Yes, quite.
That has to be the only thing we're really interested in this inquiry, not the minutiae. Who said F?
Absolutely right, Stanley.
Do you think your son agrees with you?
I think he probably does. I think he will, as it were, defend, but it's not up. I mean, he'll probably defend it here as a GB News.
Yeah, well, he'll be next week.
I'd love to ask him.
I think.
Well, I very much hope so. The answer is, if I were Boris, which I'm obviously not, I would say I'm perfectly ready to have the inquiry to look at the decisions I took vis-a-vis lockdown. Now, in retrospect, I think Boris would also accept that actually, maybe, we all rushed to lockdown too quickly.
Yes. And yet every question at this COVID inquiry seems to be predicated on the notion, why didn't you lock down sooner? Why didn't you close the borders? Why didn't you do more faster sooner? And at the time, let's remember, the Labour Party were also calling for that. The pressure was immense.
I know, and that, of course, is as it were, quote unquote, the fault of a political democratic system.